The phone call started like a whisper of smoke, curling under the door of his daughter's bedroom, threatening to suffocate him. Darius stood with his back pressed against the cool drywall, the faint scent of lavender from Maya's humidifier filling his lungs, a stark contrast to the acid churning in his gut. On the other side of the door, in his living room, Elizabeth Vance, the CEO of his company, was on the phone with her lawyer, and every word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of the life he had so carefully built. "Claire, I woke up in someone's house," she said, her voice raw, stripped of its usual boardroom authority. "A man's house. I'm wearing clothes that aren't mine. A sweatshirt and sweatpants. I don't remember anything after the second glass of champagne." Darius closed his eyes. He knew this script. He had seen variations of it play out on the news his entire life. A black man, his drunk, powerful white boss, in his modest Queens apartment. It didn't matter what had actually happened. The story wrote itself, and it never, ever had a happy ending for the man who looked like him. He had spent the last 5 years since Jasmine's passing building a fortress of impeccable conduct around himself and his daughter, a life so clean, so beyond reproach, that no one could ever question his character. One night, one single act of decency, had brought the whole thing crashing down. He had found her by the service exit of the hotel ballroom, the annual corporate gala swirling with forced laughter and clinking glasses behind them. Elizabeth Vance, a woman who commanded billion-dollar mergers with an icy stare, was slumped against the wall, her designer gown pulled around her ankles, her face a mask of utter desolation. He'd seen glimpses of it before, in the tight set of her jaw during meetings, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. The whole office knew about the spectacularly ugly divorce she was going through. But this was different. This was a complete collapse. He had approached cautiously, the way he approached everything outside the sanctuary of his home. "Miss Vance," he'd said softly, "are you all right?" She had looked up, her eyes unfocused, and for a second he saw not a CEO, but just a woman drowning in pain. "He took them," she'd slurred, a tear tracing a path through her makeup. "My kids. He's using my kids." His first instinct was to walk away, call her assistant, find another female executive, do anything other than get involved. As a senior analyst, he was a ghost in the machine. Good at his job, quiet, invisible. Invisibility was safety. But then he thought of Maya, of the fierce, protective love that was the entire animating force of his existence. He thought of what Jasmine would have said. "Everyone's fighting a battle you can't see. Be kind." So he had done the right thing. He'd helped her up, deflected the smirking glances of a few junior associates, and guided her out to the valet. He told the driver of her town car to go home. He couldn't, in good conscience, send her home to an empty mansion in this state. He certainly couldn't take her to a hotel. The only safe place he could think of, the only place he could control, was his own. It was a terrible, reckless idea, but it felt like the only humane one. Now, listening to the terror in her voice, he realized humanity was a luxury he couldn't afford. "A man from my company," she was saying to her friend. "Darius, I think his name is Darius. He's an analyst. Oh God, Claire, what if he—" She didn't have to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Darius felt his breath catch. He had to do something. But what? Bursting in would look like a confession. Staying hidden felt like one, too. He was trapped. He looked around Maya's room, his anchor in a world that was suddenly spinning off its axis. Her drawings were taped to the wall, a riot of color and crooked smiles. Her scent was on the pillow next to where he'd laid his head for a few fitful hours of sleep on the floor. He had given up his own bed, of course. He'd laid Elizabeth down, taken off her painful heels, and covered her with a quilt Jasmine's grandmother had made. He had retreated to Maya's room, leaving the door ajar just enough to hear if she got sick, and had slept on the rug at the foot of his daughter's bed. He had done everything right, and it was all about to go so horribly wrong. He'd missed it. The thought hit him with a fresh wave of nausea. Last night was Maya's spring pageant. She was the narrator. The voice of the forest, she'd called it. He had promised her he'd be in the front row, that he'd film the whole thing. He had never, not once, broken a promise to his daughter. Until last night. He had called Mrs. Patterson, their saint of a neighbor, and asked her to take Maya home from the school, his voice tight with an explanation he couldn't fully give. An emergency at work, he'd said, hating the lie. The disappointment in Maya's voice over the phone had been a physical blow. "You have to call the police, Elizabeth," the voice on the phone, Claire insisted, sharp and clinical. "Right now. We document everything. We get you out of there." Darius's blood ran cold. The police. That was it. Game over. He could already see the headlines, the whispers in the office, the questions from Child Protective Services. A single black father. A vulnerable white woman. The narrative was predetermined. His carefully constructed world was about to be reduced to a stereotype. He looked at Maya's smiling face in a framed photo on her nightstand, her 2 front teeth missing. He had built this life for her, a life of stability and love, a shield against the harshness of the world. And in one night, he had become the very thing he was trying to protect her from. A threat. He had a choice to make, one that would define not just his future, but hers. He just didn't know what the right move was. Every option felt like a step off a cliff. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment for a long moment. Darius held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He was a man who lived by a code, a set of rules designed for survival in a world that wasn't always designed for him. Rule 1. Never be in a room alone with a white woman who could be perceived as vulnerable. It was a cynical, ugly rule, but one his father had drilled into him, a lesson passed down through generations. And he had broken it. He hadn't just broken it. He had shattered it into a million pieces by bringing Elizabeth Vance into his home, the sacred space he shared with his daughter. He remembered the drive from Manhattan to Queens. She'd been mostly silent, slumped against the passenger side window of his sensible sedan, a car chosen for safety ratings, not for style. The city lights had blurred past them, painting fleeting streaks of neon and gold across her face. At a red light in Long Island City, she had stirred, her voice thick. "Where are we going?" "My place," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's quiet. You'll be safe." "Safe?" She'd let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "There's no such thing as safe." He hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd said nothing. He just drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. When they'd arrived, he'd helped her up the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment, her arm surprisingly frail in his hand. The place was clean, almost obsessively so. Maya's toys were in their designated bins, the mail was sorted on the small entryway table, and a faint scent of the chicken and rice he'd made for dinner still lingered in the air. It was a home, not a house, and the sudden intrusion of this woman from a different universe felt jarring. He had settled her on his couch, his mind racing. He needed to call Mrs. Patterson. He checked his watch. 9:15 p.m. Maya's pageant had started 15 minutes ago. A sharp, painful guilt twisted in his chest. He had promised. He had sworn on a stack of her favorite comic books that he would be there, front and center. "I'm going to be the loudest clapper, sweet pea," he'd told her that morning, kissing the top of her head as she'd tied the laces on her sneakers. "They're going to have to tell me to keep it down." The memory was a knife. He stepped into his bedroom to make the call, closing the door behind him. "Mrs. Patterson, a retired nurse with a no-nonsense voice and a heart of gold, picked up on the second ring. "Darius, I was just about to call you. Where are you? The show is starting." "I know, Mrs. P. I'm so sorry. There's an emergency at work. A colleague. I can't leave them. Can you please take Maya home for me? I'll explain later. And can you film it? The whole thing?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Patterson had been their neighbor since before Maya was born. She had held Jasmine's hand during her illness, and had held his after. She knew him. She knew he wouldn't miss this for anything less than a catastrophe. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice softening. "Don't you worry about a thing. I'll tell her you love her." He had hung up the phone and leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling like the worst father on the planet. This was the sacrifice. This was the cost of doing the right thing for a stranger. Your own child's heart. He had found a set of Jasmine's old sweats, a soft grey cotton pair she used to live in on lazy Sundays. They were folded neatly in the back of a drawer, and pulling them out felt both like a betrayal and a comfort. He left them on the armchair in the living room with a glass of water and a note. "Miss Vance, you are unwell. You're at my apartment in Queens. You are safe. My name is Darius Washington. I work in the analytics department. I'll be in my daughter's room if you need anything." He had hesitated before signing his name, the act of identifying himself feeling like signing a confession. He had then coaxed her off the couch and pointed her toward his bedroom. "You can sleep in here. The bathroom is through that door." She had moved like a sleepwalker, not even seeming to register him. He'd closed the door gently behind her, and then retreated to Maya's room, to the floor, where he'd stared at the glow in the dark stars on the ceiling and prayed he hadn't just ruined his life. Now, listening to the conversation in the other room, it seemed his prayers had gone unanswered. "He's black, Claire," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he couldn't hear her through the thin apartment walls. The word hung in the air. It was the unspoken context for everything. It was the adjective that changed the entire meaning of the sentence. Darius felt a familiar, cold fury rise in him. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger, but a deep, glacial rage that he had learned to control and channel his entire life. It was the rage of being constantly misinterpreted, of having to be twice as good to be considered half as decent, of knowing that his skin color was seen by some as a weapon. "Okay, Elizabeth, listen to me." Claire's voice was sharp, professional. "Do not talk to him. Do not drink anything. Lock yourself in the bathroom. I'm looking him up right now. Darius Washington, single father. Okay, I'm sending a car. It will be there in 40 minutes. I'll be on the line with you until it arrives. Just stay calm." 40 minutes. 40 minutes until a black car arrived and his boss was whisked away, leaving behind a story that would curdle and fester in the corporate offices of Vance Capital. A story where he was the villain. He had 40 minutes to figure out how to defuse a bomb that was already ticking. He pushed himself off the wall. Inaction was a decision, and it was the wrong one. He had to face her. He had to reclaim the narrative she was creating. He walked out of Maya's room and into the hallway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Elizabeth was standing by the window, her back to him, phone pressed to her ear. She was wearing Jasmine's sweats. The sight was a punch to the gut. They were too big for her, hanging off her slender frame, making her look small and fragile. It was a grotesque parody of the woman he had loved, the woman who had filled this small apartment with so much light and laughter. He cleared his throat. "Miss Vance." She spun around, a startled gasp escaping her lips. Her eyes were wide with fear, the phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. He saw himself reflected in her pupils. A large black man, standing in the hallway of his apartment. A threat. "I can hear you," he said, his voice quiet but firm, holding her gaze. "And I think you should know. I slept on the floor of my 9-year-old daughter's bedroom. I missed her school pageant. something I promised her I would never do, to make sure you got home safe. The clothes you're wearing belong to my late wife." He let the words settle in the space between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He just stated the facts, laying them down like stones to build a bridge across the chasm of her fear. He was giving her a choice, to see him as a man, a father, a person who had sacrificed something for her, or to see him as the monster her friend was painting him to be. Her next move would determine everything. Elizabeth stared at him, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Fear warred with confusion, and underneath it all, a flicker of something else. Shame, perhaps. The phone was still pressed to her ear, and he could hear the faint, tinny sound of Claire's voice, urging, demanding, advising. "Elizabeth, what's going on? Who are you talking to? Is he there?" Darius held his ground, his hands open at his sides. It was a conscious choice. No closed fists, no crossed arms. He had learned over the years that his body language was a language in itself, one that could be easily misread. He had to project calm, even as a storm raged inside him. He had to be the safest person in the room, even when he was the one in the most danger. "The note," he said, his voice still low and steady. "I left a note for you on the armchair, with a glass of water." Her eyes darted to the chair where the grey sweats had been. A folded piece of paper sat on the cushion, next to a now empty glass. She hadn't seen it. In her panic, she had seen only the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar clothes, the terrifying blank space in her memory. Slowly, as if moving through water, she lowered the phone from her ear. She walked over to the chair and picked up the note. Darius watched her read the few simple sentences he had scrawled in the middle of the night. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, seemed to drop an inch. "Claire," she said into the phone, her voice different now, quieter, less certain. I need to call you back." She hung up before Claire could protest. The silence that filled the apartment was heavy, charged with everything that had not been said. She looked from the note in her hand to his face, and for the first time, he thought she was actually seeing him. Not her employee, not a statistic, not a potential threat, but the man who had written those words. "You are safe." "My wife's name was Jasmine," Darius said, breaking the silence. He hadn't planned to say it, but the words came out anyway. Talking about her was the only way to make the space feel like his own again. She loved this apartment. She said it had good bones. We were saving up for a house in the suburbs when she got sick. He wasn't trying to elicit sympathy. He was trying to establish humanity. He was painting a picture of his life, a life that had existed long before she had stumbled into it, a life filled with love and loss and scraped knees and bedtime stories, a life that mattered. Elizabeth sank onto the arm of the couch, the note still clutched in her hand. I'm sorry," she whispered. It was a start, but the chasm was still wide. "I accepted a long time ago that the world isn't fair, Miss Vance," he continued, the words coming from a deep, weary place. "But I have one rule, one principle that I live by. I will not allow my daughter to pay the price for its unfairness. Last night I broke that rule. I let her down to help you." He paused, letting the weight of that statement land. "When she comes home from her sleepover at our neighbor's house in a few hours, she's going to ask me why I wasn't at her pageant. And I need to have a better answer for her than because I was trying to keep my job from being destroyed by a misunderstanding." This was the crux of it. It wasn't just about his reputation or his freedom. It was about Maya. It was about the world he was building for her, the example he was setting. He needed her to see a father who was strong, principled, and respected, not one who was constantly on the defensive, ducking and weaving to avoid blows from a world that saw him as less than. Elizabeth finally looked up, her eyes clear for the first time that morning. The fog of alcohol and panic was receding, replaced by a dawning horror at what she had almost done. "What did I say on that call?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You said you woke up in a black man's house," Darius said, the words blunt and unvarnished. "And in this country, that's all you need to say." The color drained from her face. She understood. Maybe not in her bones, the way he did, but she understood the power of that phrase, the terrible, destructive weight of it. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize again, but just then there was a key in the lock. The front door swung open and Maya bounced in, a whirlwind of bright pink leggings and untamed curls, clutching a slightly crumpled program from the pageant. Behind her was Mrs. Patterson, her face etched with a gentle concern. "Daddy, you're home," Maya yelled, dropping the program and running to wrap her arms around his legs. "Mrs. P said you had a work thing. Did you fix the computers? Was it a big emergency?" Darius bent down and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of kid shampoo and sunshine. He felt the tension in his shoulders release for the first time in 12 hours. This was his safe harbor. This was why he fought. "Yeah, sweet pea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was a big emergency, but I think it's going to be okay." Maya pulled back and finally noticed the stranger in their living room. Her head tilted, her big brown eyes, so much like her mother's, taking in the scene. She looked at Elizabeth, a woman in oversized, unfamiliar clothes, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She saw not a CEO, not a threat, but something else entirely. She looked up at her father. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice loud in the quiet room. "Is that the sad lady from your work?" Darius froze. He remembered a conversation from a few weeks ago. He had been on a late-night video call, and Elizabeth's face had filled the screen, looking tired and strained. Maya had come in to say goodnight and had peered at the monitor. Later, as he tucked her in, she had asked about her. "That lady looks sad," she'd said. "Like the kind where you smile, but your eyes don't." Out of the mouths of babes. Maya hadn't seen power or authority. She had seen a crack in the facade. She had seen the pain. Elizabeth heard her. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking with Maya's. The simple, unfiltered observation from a child seemed to land with more force than anything Darius had said. It stripped away the layers of corporate hierarchy and legal jeopardy, leaving only a raw, human truth. A sad lady. Mrs. Patterson, ever perceptive, assessed the situation in a single glance. She saw the tension, the unfamiliar woman, the look on Darius's face. "Maya, honey," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Why don't you and I go to the kitchen and see if there are any of those cookies left from yesterday? Let your daddy talk to his colleague." She steered Maya toward the kitchen, but Maya wasn't done. She wriggled free for a moment and walked right up to Elizabeth. She reached out a small hand and gently touched the sleeve of Jasmine's sweatshirt. "My mummy used to wear this when she was sad too," Maya said softly. She said it was like a hug from the inside. And with that, the last of Elizabeth Vance's composure shattered. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of her soul. She covered her face with her hands, her whole body shaking. Maya didn't flinch. She just stood there for a moment, her hand still on Elizabeth's arm, a small, steady point of contact in a world that had just been torn apart. Then she looked back at her dad, a question in her eyes. Darius gave her a small, reassuring nod, and she allowed Mrs. Patterson to lead her away. The sound of the cookie jar opening in the kitchen was the only noise. Darius remained where he was, giving Elizabeth the space she needed. The situation had shifted dramatically. The presence of his daughter, her innocent wisdom, had done more than an army of lawyers ever could. She had held up a mirror not just to Elizabeth, but to the entire ugly situation, and had reflected back a simple, undeniable truth. There were no monsters here, just people. People who were hurting, people who were scared, and people who were trying their best to navigate a complicated world. Elizabeth finally lowered her hands. Her face was blotchy, her mascara smeared, the carefully constructed mask of the CEO completely gone. She looked at Darius, her eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep shame. "I am so sorry," she said, and this time, the words carried the full weight of their meaning. What I almost did, what I almost allowed to happen to you. There is no excuse." "No," Darius agreed quietly. "There isn't." He wasn't going to absolve her. He wasn't going to say it's okay, because it wasn't. The fear he had felt was real. The danger was real. Her apology was necessary, but it didn't erase the wound. She seemed to understand that. She nodded, accepting his verdict. She reached for her phone, her movements deliberate now. She scrolled through her contacts and pressed a name. "Claire," she said when the call connected. Her voice was back, not the icy boardroom tone, but something new, something forged in the fire of the last hour. It was clear, steady, and unequivocal. "Claire, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Cancel the car. Do not do anything else. Nothing happened last night. I was intoxicated and distraught, and a colleague, a gentleman, made sure I was safe. He has a daughter. He missed her school performance because he was sitting on the floor of her bedroom, making sure that I, his boss, didn't choke on my own vomit. He gave me his bed, his late wife's clothes, and his respect, and I responded by putting his entire life in jeopardy. So you are going to listen, and you are going to forget every word I said to you this morning. Is that understood?" Darius felt a weight he didn't even realize he was carrying lift from his chest. It wasn't a full release, not yet, but it was enough. It was enough to breathe again. He had stood on the edge of a precipice, and for now, at least, he had been pulled back. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the edge would always be there. He would always be just one misunderstanding, one wrong move, away from falling. The call was a reprieve, not a pardon. The system that had put him in that position was still firmly in place. Elizabeth listened for a moment to the voice on the other end, her expression unyielding. "I don't care what you think is advisable, Claire. I am telling you what the truth is, and I am telling you what you are going to do. Now I have to go. I have a situation here that I need to make right." She hung up the phone and placed it face down on the coffee table, a gesture of finality. She turned her full attention back to Darius. The power dynamic had been scrambled and reassembled. She was still the CEO, he was still the analyst, but the space between them was now filled with a raw, uncomfortable, and deeply human reality. "How do I make this right?" she asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She was asking for a roadmap, for a way to navigate the wreckage she had caused. Darius thought for a long moment. He could ask for a promotion, a raise, a transfer. He could leverage this moment for personal gain. The old survival instincts told him to do just that, to take what he could from this disaster. But when he looked at her, he didn't see an opportunity. He saw the sad lady Maya had seen, and he thought about what Jasmine would have wanted. She would have wanted him to choose dignity. Not just his own, but hers too. "You can't fix this with money, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "You can't write a check to make up for the fact that for an hour this morning, I was terrified that I was going to lose my daughter because of the color of my skin and the circumstances you created." The words were a direct hit. He saw her flinch, but she didn't look away. She took it. "This isn't about a transaction," he continued. "This is about understanding. I need you to understand what it felt like for me this morning. I need you to sit with the fact that your first instinct, your lawyer's first instinct, was to believe the worst of me, without a single piece of evidence." He walked over to the small bookshelf by the window. He pulled out a photo album, its leather cover worn smooth with time. He opened it to a picture of him and a radiant-looking Jasmine, holding a tiny newborn Maya. They were in this very living room, looking exhausted and deliriously happy. "This is my life," he said, holding the album out to her. "This is what was at stake. Not a job, not a reputation among people I barely know. This." Elizabeth took the album from him, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the photograph, at the image of a family, of a love so palpable it seemed to radiate from the glossy paper. She traced the outline of Jasmine's smiling face with her finger. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She was," Darius confirmed. "And she was the bravest person I ever knew. She taught me that you don't measure a person's worth by their title or their bank account. You measure it by their character, by how they treat people when no one is looking." He had spent the night treating her with a decency he felt she hadn't earned, but that his own character demanded. He had done it when no one was looking, and the irony was that this quiet act of integrity had nearly cost him everything. It was in this charged moment that she said it. It wasn't meant with malice, he knew that, but with a kind of clumsy, privileged ignorance that was, in some ways, even more insulting. She looked up from the photo, her eyes swimming with a confusing mix of guilt and pity. "It must be so hard," she said, her voice laced with a genuine, if misguided, sympathy. "Being a single father, trying to do it all on your own, juggling this and your job." She gestured vaguely around the apartment, then back at him. "You can't please any woman, can you? You try to be a good employee to me, and you disappoint your daughter. You try to be a good father, and I'm sure it affects your work. It's an impossible position." The words hung in the air, a stunning misinterpretation of everything he had just told her. He had laid his soul bare, explained the systemic terror he had faced, and she had reduced it to a work-life balance problem. "You can't please any woman." The phrase landed like a slap. It wasn't just about him and Maya, or him and her. It was a judgment on his entire capacity as a man, a father, a professional. It implied a fundamental inadequacy, a failure to measure up. The cold fury he had suppressed earlier returned, but this time it was different. It was sharper, clearer. It was the anger of being profoundly, fundamentally misunderstood. He took a deep breath. He could yell, he could rage, but that would only confirm the stereotype he was fighting against. Instead, he chose his words with surgical precision. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "my worth is not determined by my ability to please you or anyone else. My worth is in that kitchen, eating cookies with my neighbor. My worth is in the promises I keep to her. My worth was in the respect I showed you last night when you had none for yourself." He took the photo album back from her hands and closed it gently. "You see my life as a series of impossible choices and deficits. You see a single father struggling. You see a black man who can't get ahead, but you don't see me. You don't see that my life is not a tragedy. It's a love story. It's the story of a man who would do anything, sacrifice anything, for his child. Missing a pageant was painful, but it was a choice I made. What happened this morning? That was not a choice. That was a reality that was forced upon me. And that is what you need to understand." He had shown her his worth, not with a resume or a performance review, but with his principles, with his love for his daughter, with the quiet dignity of his anger. He had refused her pity and demanded her respect. The kitchen door creaked open and Maya emerged, a smear of chocolate on her cheek. She held a plate with a single cookie on it. She walked past her father and straight to Elizabeth. "This is for you," she said, holding out the plate. "Daddy says cookies help when your heart is hurting." Elizabeth looked at the cookie, then at the little girl offering it, and finally at the father who had raised her. And in that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. She wasn't just ashamed, she was humbled. She was in the presence of a kind of integrity, a kind of love that her money could not buy and her power could not command. She had come here as a boss and had been taught a lesson in grace by an employee and his 9-year-old daughter. The world, she was beginning to realize, was a much bigger and more complicated place than she had ever imagined from the top of her skyscraper. Elizabeth reached out and took the cookie, her hand steady now. "Thank you, Maya," she said, her voice thick but clear. "Thank you very much." She looked at Darius over Maya's head, and her eyes conveyed a message that went beyond a simple apology. It was a look of profound, dawning respect. The ground between them had irrevocably shifted. The process of making it right had just begun, not with a transaction, but with a shared, fragile moment of humanity, offered on a plate by a little girl with chocolate on her cheek. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Vance Capital was subtly different, at least for Darius. The change wasn't overt. There was no company-wide memo, no public declaration. It was in the small things. It was in the way Elizabeth Vance met his eyes during the Monday morning team meeting. A brief, direct nod of acknowledgement that no one else would have noticed, but that felt to Darius like a treaty being signed. It was in the email he received from HR on Tuesday, informing him of a new company policy providing additional flexible leave for single parents, a policy he knew hadn't existed the week before. It was a quiet, targeted act of institutional change, a way of making things right without making a spectacle of it. He and Elizabeth didn't speak of that morning again, not directly. There was an unspoken understanding that the events were too raw, the implications too vast, to be rehashed over coffee in the break room. But a new line of communication had been opened. She started emailing him directly for his input on data sets, bypassing the usual chain of command. Her questions were sharp, focused on his expertise, a clear signal that she saw his professional value. It was her way of saying, "I see you. I see your work. I see your worth." One afternoon, a week after the incident, he was working late, trying to get ahead so he could leave early for Maya's rescheduled pageant performance. An email popped up from Elizabeth. The subject line was simply, "Tonight." The body of the email was short. "I understand your daughter has a performance tonight at 6 p.m. I've cleared your schedule for the rest of the day. Go, be the loudest clapper." Darius stared at the screen. She had remembered. She had remembered his words, the small, painful detail of what he had sacrificed. It was a small gesture, but it was significant. It wasn't about giving him permission. He would have gone anyway. It was about acknowledgement. It was about being seen. He packed his bag, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. As he walked toward the elevators, he passed Claire, Elizabeth's lawyer friend, who was waiting in the reception area. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. She had been the voice on the phone, the one urging Elizabeth to see him as a predator. Darius met her gaze and gave a slight, polite nod. He wasn't going to shy away. He had nothing to be ashamed of. To his surprise, Claire stood up and walked over to him. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice formal. I wanted to apologize for my counsel to Elizabeth that morning. I was operating from a playbook, not from a place of humanity. I was wrong. It was a stiff, lawyerly apology, but it was an apology nonetheless. It was another crack in the wall of misunderstanding. "Playbooks can be dangerous," Darius said simply. "They don't always account for the people involved." She nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. "Elizabeth is changing. You have a remarkable daughter." "I know," Darius said, a smile finally breaking through. "I'm on my way to see her prove it right now." The school auditorium was buzzing with the chaotic energy of parents and children. Darius found a seat in the front row, right in the center, a prime location he had staked out early. He held his phone up, ready to record, a promise he was determined to keep this time. Mrs. Patterson saved the seat next to him, arriving just before the lights went down. "Look at you," she whispered, patting his arm. "Front and center, just where you belong." just where I promised I'd be," he corrected gently. When the curtains opened, Maya was standing at a small lectern at the side of the stage, dressed in a costume that made her look like a wise little oak tree. She looked out at the audience, her eyes scanning the faces. He saw the moment she found him. A huge, radiant smile lit up her face. A private signal just for him. He smiled back, giving her a small thumbs up. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice clear and confident, filling the auditorium. "The forest has many secrets," she began. "It knows that the tallest trees were once small seeds, and that even after the darkest storm, the sun will find a way to reach the ground." Darius watched her, his heart swelling with a fierce, overwhelming love. This was his why. This little girl, with her profound, simple truths, was the center of his universe. Everything he did, every cautious step he took, every battle he fought, was to ensure that she could stand on a stage like this and feel safe, loved, and limitless. He recorded the entire performance, his hand perfectly steady. He clapped until his palms were red, hooting and cheering when she took her final bow. She ran to him afterwards, throwing her arms around his neck, smelling of stage makeup and exhilaration. "You came, Daddy. You were the loudest," she squealed into his ear. "I promised, didn't I?" he said, hugging her tight. And a Washington always keeps their promises. Later that night, after Maya was asleep, her pageant program tucked under her pillow, Darius sat in the quiet of his living room. He thought about the whirlwind of the past week. He had been to the edge and back. He had faced down a stereotype that had the power to destroy lives, and he had come out the other side, not unscathed, but intact. More than intact. He felt stronger. For years he had lived his life trying to be invisible. He believed that invisibility was his armor, his only defense. Trying to avoid mistakes, trying to never give anyone a reason to question his character. But that night with Elizabeth, he had made a different choice. He had stepped out of the shadows and into a situation fraught with peril. He had chosen kindness over caution, humanity over self-preservation. And somehow, against all odds, it had led him here, to a place of new understanding, of earned respect. Maybe the world wasn't fair. He knew it wasn't. Maybe it never would be. But maybe, just maybe, there were still people who could be made to see. People like Elizabeth, who had been blinded by their privilege, but were not incapable of opening their eyes. People who could learn, who could change, who could be taught to look past the playbook and see the person standing in front of them. There was a soft knock on his door. It was late after 10. He wasn't expecting anyone. He looked through the peephole and was stunned to see Elizabeth Vance standing in the hallway. She wasn't dressed in a power suit, but in simple jeans and a sweater. She was holding a large, flat box. He opened the door, a question on his face. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," she said, her voice soft. I didn't want to send this with a messenger." She held the box out to him. He took it and opened it. Inside was a beautifully framed professional photograph. It was a candid shot from the company's charity 5K a few months back. He was crossing the finish line, with Maya riding on his shoulders. They were both laughing, their faces filled with pure, unadulterated joy. He had never even seen the photo before. "My marketing team took hundreds of photos that day," she explained. "I was looking through them for the annual report, and I found this one. I thought you should have it." It was more than just a photo. It was a message. It was her showing him how she saw him now. Not as an analyst, not as a threat, not as a problem to be managed, but as a father, a joyful, loving father. "And this," she said, holding out a small envelope, "this isn't for you, it's for Maya." He took the envelope. Inside was a card, and tucked inside the card were 2 tickets. Not to a fancy gala or a corporate box at a game. They were season passes to the Queen's Botanical Garden, On the card, in elegant handwriting, she had written, "For Maya, your mother was right. This apartment has good bones, but every voice of the forest needs a forest to listen to. Thank you for the cookie." Elizabeth. It was the perfect gift. It was thoughtful, personal, and completely devoid of the transactional pity he had feared. It was a gift of presence, not presence. It was an acknowledgement of his life, his loss, and his love for his daughter. It was a gesture of true, respectful friendship. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he said, using her first name for the first time. The formality of Miss Vance no longer fit the space between them. "No, Darius," she said, meeting his gaze. "Thank you for everything." She didn't stay long. She just gave a small, genuine smile and left. Darius closed the door and leaned against it, looking at the photograph in his hands. He saw the man in the picture, a man defined not by his caution or his fear, but by his joy and his love. Maybe that was who he could be all the time. Not just inside the walls of his apartment, but out in the world. He walked over to the bookshelf and placed the new frame next to the picture of him and Jasmine with a newborn Maya. The two images told a story of love, of loss, of resilience, and of a bond between a father and daughter that was strong enough to weather any storm. A story that was still being written. He knew the world outside his door hadn't changed overnight. The dangers were still there. The prejudices still lingered. But he had changed. He had learned that sometimes the only way to be truly safe is to be truly seen. He had refused to be a stereotype, and in doing so, had forced someone else to see the man. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Darius's story reminds us that character isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the small choices when no one is watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about real people facing real challenges with grace. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Darius's situation?